There we go. All right, recording has started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mark Takata. I am the technical evangelist for ColdFusion here at Adobe. And we are going to be talking today about the Adobe ColdFusion Administrator Part 1. And I'm not sure how many parts there will be, probably 2 or 3 maybe at some point in the future, because the administrator is an incredibly powerful and flexible tool that is kind of unique in the development world. It creates an ecosystem for people to use to do just about anything you need it to do, actually. And we're going to be going into that. Today is going to be more of an overview rather than a deep dive or detailed description of any one part. If you have an interest in hearing much more about a particular section that I cover today or in future talks, please do email me. My email is takata@adobe.com. I will be covering that at the end with a slide that will tell you how you can get a hold of me, how you can get business hours, how you can get office hours with me, and just generally chat with me about a variety of things. So if you have questions, by the way, regarding anything that you're seeing here today that you want me to answer at the end, we're going to have like a brief Q&A at the end. Please do put it into the Q&A pod. There's a separate pod. It's at the bottom center of your screen today, at least if you're on a PC. If you're on a phone, I don't know what it looks like, but hopefully you'll be able to see it. The reason for that is the chat gets totally wild and crazy with people just kind of chatting and asking and talking to each other and all that. Makes it really hard for me to go back and answer questions. The pod will let me focus on those a little more. So awesome. I'm going to go ahead and start up with just a brief introduction to who I am. Again, my name is Mark Takata. I've been with Adobe for just over a year. I am the evangelist for ColdFusion, which means I get to do things like this, talk to all of you about features inside of ColdFusion. I've actually been programming in ColdFusion for almost 25 years, getting pretty close there. It was my first language that I learned way back in the day when Alaire still owned it, and I was at the University of California at Davis, programming in CF, and we were using FileMaker as our database, and it was just a wild and super fun time. Since then, I've learned 12 other languages and used them professionally, and now I am back at Adobe talking to you about ColdFusion. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to be covering the administrator here. Now, something that like a lot of folks don't really think about is that not everyone is familiar with the administrator. And that's a surprise to a lot of people, actually. But really, if all that you've ever done is used hosted ColdFusion solutions, for example, at like a Host Tech or one of those types of places, you probably have never seen the administrator and certainly have never seen it at full power with all of the things that it can do, because a hosted solution is going to limit your ability to actually go in and change things just for security's sake, right? It's a shared environment. And so we're going to be kind of delving into things that might be obvious to you, but, you know, I kind of want to share it with people who may not have actually seen this, just so they can go ahead and install it locally and try it out for themselves. Remember, there is a version of ColdFusion that you can install for free on your local machine and use it to your heart's delight in non-production stuff. You can use it to learn ColdFusion. It's called Developer Mode. And some of the things you'll see today are not necessarily turned on in that mode, but a lot of them are. And certainly the administrator in general is something that you can get into. So here we are. If you see, I have this installed locally. And to get to the administrator, you would do localhost, right? That's where my computer is. Normally, you will install ColdFusion to 8500 port. It's kind of generally what most people do. And then you will type cfide/administrator/index.cfm, and booyah, you are here. When setting up ColdFusion, you would have, oh, Jeff is unable to hear anything. Everybody else can hear, right? Yeah, obviously you guys were talking about Aggies. Apurva, could you help out Jeff? Anyway, so When installing ColdFusion locally, you're going to be asked for an admin user password, and that's what it is here. You know, I used some crazy password in the past, and that's what we're at. So let's start off with the very first page. And wow, is it a doozy. This is the one that I barely was able to get through when I did this on my stream earlier. So we're going to maybe not cover every single piece here. But just generally, what is the administrator? Let's just talk about that and cover that just at the beginning. The administrator is essentially a control dashboard for your ColdFusion server, and it does a lot of things. It controls things like timeouts. It controls things like creating objects for you to use inside of your code. It does security. It actually changes some language features. There's things that you can switch on and off inside of it. You can actually send commands inside of it to the JVM to do a variety of optimizations. So it's really, really amazing and powerful. And I'm not sure I've really ran into anything quite like it in the development world. So starting off, this is kind of the big one. This is the main page that you first start off on. It's the server settings. By the way, if you get in here and all you see is all of these icons on the left and you're wondering, Mark, what the heck is this? Like, what's going on with this monitor? And there's like a tablet or, I don't know, a pager behind it. If you go up here and hit the hamburger, it will actually give you descriptions for what each of those main sections are. So that's something, actually, I've had people like ask me about that. And it's not real obvious that that's what that little menu will do. So this will actually show you, oh, hey, these are all the different places that we can go and look at stuff. So under server settings, under the very, very first sub-tab, so all of these things up here are tabs under the server settings first menu item. Yes, it's a lot. So we're going to try to go through it fairly quickly. So the first thing that you'll see here is this lets you do timeout requests. So this is any request that's actually coming into your server. You can set a global timeout. Now, as you all know, timeouts are actually, they're like a volcano type situation. If you set a timeout here and don't set a timeout anywhere else, great. This is the timeout that you'll use. If you set a timeout inside of your application.cfc or something deeper down into your app, it's going to use the value that's the closest to the event that's happening. So keep that in mind, that in some cases, the things that are being put in here can and will be overwritten. And especially when you have this one, this actual setting set here, enable per application settings. So essentially, if you uncheck this, you will get global attribution of settings across all of your applications on your server. I don't like to do that because, well, I like to set things individually if possible and have that option. Sometimes you need a particular application to act in some way. So whenever I set anything up, I start off with it checked that it's per application. This one here is actually an interesting one. So when you are setting CF tokens, you can use CF tokens for a bunch of things. It actually will use a UUID to do that. Now, why is that important? Well, the reason is that if you don't have that set, the random number that is generated is not necessarily guaranteed to be unique. UUIDs are. So this actually happened to a client of mine. They were using CF tokenized application variables for essentially trying to assure that a particular user's actions were unique. They didn't have this set, and it was fine up until about 2,000 or 3,000 people were using the system simultaneously, at which point they began to see collisions, which is bad. Unfortunately for them, they did not know about this necessarily. It was a piece of code that was actually rather old, and so they found out in the hardest possible way, which is when everything was under a great deal of load. It was not fun. So definitely think about this like ahead of time. It doesn't really cost the system anything. It's a good setting to have up there. White space management. This is a fun one. If you are an old time ColdFusion developer way back in the day, you may remember that way back in the day when you had a ColdFusion page and you rendered it out and you looked at the actual HTML that came to the browser, there were all kinds of spaces and like breaks and lines and things like that, and new lines that would get generated based on your code. And there was, I believe there was a tag called suppress whitespace. There was all these other ways of doing it, and that's what we did to get around it, because honestly, it was kind of a pain and kind of a bear to go through and debug it when you had to sit there and scroll through a bunch of whitespace. It's now built into the server to suppress that whitespace. So it's kind of a nice feature. It's been around for a while. I mean, again, I've been doing this for 25 years, so it's been a minute since that was a problem, but that is being set here. Of course, HTTP status codes, you want that on because you want ColdFusion to be able to set stuff over. This is an interesting one. So this is one that is a backwards compatibility issue. Preserving case for struct keys for serialization. So this is kind of somewhat new. I think it's been around for a couple of versions. Structs tend to put everything in uppercase. And so this actually will preserve case across when you're like changing things and serializing things and moving from structs to other places. This is actually going to set it. This can break things if you're using old code that is not expecting this to happen. So something to keep in mind. And again, like on Windows, case doesn't matter as much. Linux, it does. So that's fun. Prefixing serialized JSON. So this is a cross-site scripting attack protection that you can put in place. You can essentially prefix JSON with a particular set of characters. You can choose what they are. The common one is // You can actually put in anything you want. That's something you can use depending on how you are setting up your code to pull in JSON. Just remember that you did that, because you'll be like, why is it sending this stuff across? I've had that happen before, where people were filing bugs that their JSON was getting stuff put into it, and turns out, yeah, the administrator was set up to actually do that for them. So communication is fun. This stuff, I'm not going to get really into it. If you know, you know. In-file memory system is actually a really powerful tool, but I could talk for a whole day on that. Global script protection, yeah, you kind of want that on. This is a big one right here. Disable creation of unnamed applications. How many of you know that you need to name your applications? You do. Because if you don't, they end up being put into a very, very strange global application scope of an unnamed app. This happened to a friend of mine who actually thought this was related to ORM. They were at a summit and they ended up in an elevator with, oh gosh, who was it? Ben Forda and someone else. I'm not sure who the other person was. And they asked about this weird problem that they were having about all of the memory just going crazy on their machine, and just these weird variable things where things were getting overwritten. They didn't know what was happening. It was very confusing. They thought it was related to ORM. They asked Ben Forda and this other person in the elevator about what was going on. The other person said, well, your problem is because you're using ORM, which of course my friend's face fell, and they said, oh, okay. And Ben kind of looks at the guy and says, no, don't listen to them. And the first thing they asked was, are you naming all of your applications uniquely? And he said, well, no. Uh-oh, right? And that was the problem. And so they had actually been trying to get around this by doing these weird, like, prefixing of variable names across different applications and all that. So this would actually prevent you from having this problem. Because if you tried to create an app that didn't have a name, ColdFusion would say, no, bad, don't do that. All right. Null support, that's another big one that's fairly new. ColdFusion, until fairly recently, did not support null. It didn't know what null was. And now you can set it so that it does. Keep in mind this actually does change the way that some functions function. For example, is null with this turned off acts as the opposite of is defined. Okay. With this turned on, it will literally be a check for null. So this can break your apps potentially if you have old code that is relying on that function in the old way that it was working. So just kind of keep that in mind. Let's see. I'm going to just kind of come down through a lot of there's a lot in here. Request size limits. This is something that comes up quite a bit, and this can actually bite you in the rear end if you are not ready for it. So there is a maximum number of post request parameters being set. This is done to prevent, well, to prevent a lot of things like denial of service attacks. Potentially, if someone is able to like put in a bunch of post parameters, they can overwhelm the memory in your server and other things. The problem here is if you have a dynamic page and you are generating a bunch of form fields that people are filling out, you can very, very easily overwhelm this particular parameter. I've seen it happen multiple times, and it's not a very good error that comes back from it, right? You actually need to, like, again, this is sort of on our side. We don't do a good job telling you that this is why this particular thing is happening, unless you go to the logs. And then if you actually look in the logs, you will see that is the error that's happening, and then you can go in and change it. So a case where I saw this happening was there was a site that was doing some management of student information. It had a bunch of rows and a bunch of columns, and all of the columns had form fields that you could edit students' names. The people who wrote it thought that they were being clever by allowing you to edit all the student information at the same time, which I guess they were in some way. However, the page that got submitted had all of those parameters in place. Even if you don't change it, it's still a post parameter, right? And so very quickly, they found that they were getting these errors. It wasn't clear what was going on. We were able to fix it by adding up in here. You have to be careful, though. Again, this can really do a number on your memory on your server. So just be careful there. And finally, the final thing I'm gonna talk about here on the settings page. Wow, I've managed to do this in under 20 minutes. This is a new record for me since I'm just like flying through this. API Manager, REST Discovery. Okay, so if you are using the API Manager, meaning you have ColdFusion Enterprise running, if you have it, I highly recommend using API Manager. They're awesome. If you want to learn a little bit about how to use it, Brian Sappy, who's a good friend of ours, does some awesome trainings on the API Manager. To allow the API Manager to discover REST endpoints that you've created, you must come in here and turn this to on. Otherwise, it won't work. It won't know what it's looking at. All right. Woohoo! We are flying. Next, request tuning. So this is a little bit of optimization work that you can do. And this is actually, this very, very first one I have seen come up on a fairly large number of client sites that are getting hit really, really hard. And we're not really sure what was going on. They were having timeouts. Things were just like working in a funny way. They kept throwing hardware at the problem, and it wasn't really resolving it. The reason why is there is a maximum number of simultaneous template requests that ColdFusion, that you can tell ColdFusion to handle. Now, does that mean it can't handle more? No, it absolutely can handle more if there's enough hardware behind it. But if you set this to 25, which is the default number, it is only going to handle 25, and it's going to pull other things back into the queue, which can cause timeouts because it's only able to handle 25 at a time. So I have seen this number vary depending on the use case. This is really a knob you need to tune and change and test. Okay, there's not really a number that goes in here that is the end-all, be-all solution. So if you are having some performance issues, if you're using the performance monitoring tool and you're seeing timeouts and things that are running long, this is a potential place that you could go to maybe turn a knob and make it work better. Now, of course, you have to be on decent hardware, right? So, but throwing more and more hardware at the problem actually may not be the solution that you need. In one particular case, I had a client that had something like 15 servers that they had put behind a load balancer to try and handle these timeouts that they were running into. And it really turns out the issue was not hardware, it wasn't bandwidth, it wasn't horsepower, it wasn't any of that. It was this setting was artificially gating the amount of requests that were able to go through the system. When we tuned this up, and I don't really remember what the final number was that we got to. It was probably closer to 100 or over 100 simultaneous. Once we got there, it was actually working really, really smoothly. And of course, we ran into other issues down the path, which turned out to be database, unfortunately. So we had no way of fixing that. We had to tune down a little bit to allow the database to be able to keep up, because ColdFusion is fast. It can really, really do a lot of work in a very short amount of time. You just need to be able to set it to do that properly. All right, flash remoting. Who's using flash remoting? Yeah, none of you. Nobody's using that anymore. There's a lot of settings here, some simultaneous CFC function requests. Again, a lot of things here, just little dials and knobs to be able to turn. This is here a really good one. If you're doing asynchronous programming using CF thread, you're throwing stuff into threads to get processed and bring back down. This is a setting where you can put a max number of those. Again, we're talking about how much room do we have in memory. It depends what the CF thread is doing, right? What is it processing? If it's just doing some calculations, but there's a lot of them, you might be able to get away with getting this bigger and higher up. Again, too, some of these settings are not available in the standard edition of ColdFusion, by the way. So like the lower versions don't have as many dials and knobs to turn as the Enterprise Edition, because the Enterprise Edition needs those. Those are usually the sites that are under extremely high load. They have high bandwidth requirements and they need tuning, and so you get more knobs and dials with that. Timeouts. So when you have requests that are waiting in the queue. So remember earlier we had the maximum number of processed requests, template requests that we're going to allow. If they're not allowed, they get put into the queue. Here's the second part of that. It's the other shoe falling. So how long are you allowing timeout requests to sit in the queue? This is set for 60 seconds. Again, if you are doing other timeout settings, so if you're doing timeouts in your queries, if you're doing timeouts on the page in any other way, the ones that are closest to the action are going to be the ones that affect you. Brian asked, does max threads affect code if I do not use CF thread? No, this is specifically for the CF thread functionality of ColdFusion. This actually is not does not affect, I think it's CF async. There's a different methodology of doing like promise style asynchronous processing. This does not affect that. And the reason why is that CF thread can be much more memory intensive than the other way that we're doing the process. So the other way is a little more efficient, so we don't have settings for that to tune that down. Thank you for that question. All right. Caching. Cache me outside. How about that? All right. So the maximum number of cached templates. Now, remember, a template is a ColdFusion page, both a CFM and a CFC. So if you are trying to have as many things cached as possible, and of course, that means that they're not being read, they're not being updated, yada, yada. If you have enough memory, you can actually set this number to the total number of templates in your server. That will be the most optimized way of using this. It will not change the amount of memory used to make this number higher, by the way. It's an allowable amount, but it will only cache the amount of templates that are available for it to cache. So it's not just like taking a bunch of memory space and plopping, you know, its walls around it to keep it from being used. So this is a good one to use if you want to make sure that you're caching enough. In some cases, I have seen where people had way more templates than 1024. I don't know why we said 1024. Someone was being cute. But and then what they found was they were having some performance issues potentially. And so, yeah, that was a problem because they weren't caching all of the templates. And so in some cases, on some of the non-cache templates, they were seeing performance issues versus the ones that were being cached. It was actually kind of hard to debug that until we went in and looked at this section. So that's pretty important to talk about. Caching engines. So not everyone is using these, but I don't know, maybe you should be if you've got pretty high load if you've got pretty high load applications that need it. So we support quite a number of them. EHCache, JCS, Redis. Redis is extremely popular. It's extremely performant. You can set that up to be local. You can set it up to not be local. Please be careful with that. I actually used a Redis install that was on something that it requires warming. And that caused all sorts of issues because when I went out to get values from the Redis cache, it had not been warmed up, and ColdFusion said, "Oh, it doesn't exist," and blew up. So be careful. Be careful with being there. And of course, Memcache. There are a lot of settings here. Of course, there's all of the access permissions for each of them. Okay, now here is some important stuff. If you are developing, I know a lot of us as developers, when we're actually doing the coding, not super happy about caches until we're actually doing performance testing, right? Because you write something, you try to load it, it hasn't updated because that template is cached and you need to clear it out. Can be really frustrating. And you're never really sure like when it's gonna like check for the thing, so you'll do it, you'll get frustrated, like, why isn't it updating? And then a minute passes and it was cached for 60 seconds and suddenly it works. Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. So some of these settings here will actually change how often caches are updated, right? So template caches, component caches, and these actually will not require you to restart the server if you change them. So you can just kind of like turn them off, refresh some pages, turn them back on if you want to do that, if you still want to have like performance locally. And make sure, though, that when you are in production, that you're using these properly to make sure that things are as performant as possible. Another thing here is saving class files. This is mostly recommended for production systems. So if you are developing or doing some things on like staging or that kind of thing, you can have this turned off, and it can kind of improve your developer experience a tiny bit. And my favorite part are all these fun buttons that you can hit just in case you think there's a caching issue. These are the buttons that you can press to nuke them from orbit. You can clear the template cache, and my favorite, the component cache, because I think 90% of my caching issues in my ColdFusion life have been with components that were misbehaving because they were cached and not changing, which is not fun. There's also, of course, a Dynamo cache and a query cache, a little bit less of an issue for me there. Client variables. So these are storage mechanisms for client sessions, right? So you can use cookies. That's the default, the registry. You can also use client stores for this as well. Let me move over there. I'm not going to get too far into this. Most folks just kind of keep this as is. Memory variables. So this is a place that you can choose where you're actually holding your sessions. So I think I mentioned earlier, if you have Redis set up, you can actually use Redis as a session cache, as a session holding functionality. This can help with, for example, when you're behind a load balancer, right? So you can keep the sessions and they can like stay sticky to your particular user in places. So this is a place where you would choose Redis. Again, this is, I did this accidentally to the wrong type of Redis. I used one of those like super cheap free Redis hosting places that cools down after about an hour, and it blew up in an extremely almost humorous way when I tried to use it. So be careful. So that's storage. And then of course, timeout. So these are some timeout periods that you can use in like CF application tags for particular functions that you're using in there. Some default timeouts for variables. Again, you can overwrite these in your application.cfc if you have the setting for application-specific changes checked on that very, very first page that we hit when we first got in here. Some session cookie stuff. There's timeouts, HTTP only, secure, all that good stuff. Again, not going to dive too deep into that. Mappings. So I'm sure that many of you have run into the issue when you were trying to use a ColdFusion tag and you were using the leading slash to go to root. And ColdFusion yelled at you because it wasn't sure what you meant by that. So one way to get around that particular issue is to use a mapping. And what that will do is you can set a logical path for the mapping and point that to the actual directory on your server. And as you can see, that directory can be, gosh, just about anywhere. I have seen this used quite successfully for shared shared function libraries that people have created, where they might exist in a server somewhere in a shared accessible space that all of the different ColdFusion user groups that were using it could point, and then that way they don't have to copy the files over to each of their individual use cases. When they're updated, everyone gets the updates. It's kind of useful, kind of powerful, kind of dangerous, because if someone goes in there and changes something to the detriment of the code or makes a bug, everybody gets the bug too. So be careful. But again, it's a really nice way to, in a good environment where you're actually doing like proper scoping and planning and all that and communication between the groups, it's a really nice way to not have to like copy files over and deal with libraries that have been updated in one place but not updated in another. That can be very confusing and frustrating and not fun. And by the way, when ColdFusion uses its kind of audit, like when you call out for a CFC, if you're trying to instantiate an object using like create object or something, it will also look into these mappings for CFC. So that's another way that you can use it. Mail. Oh, hey, I clicked you. There we go. So as many of you know, ColdFusion can be used as an email server. One note here, do keep in mind that on the Enterprise Edition of ColdFusion, the mail server is allowed to process in a multi-threaded way. So if you're sending tons and tons and tons and tons of email and need a lot to be going out, then that's the way that you want to do it. Yes, Dimitri said, questions were added to the Q&A section. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to be dropping into the Q&A and kind of going through all of the questions that have been put in there, Dimitri. So yeah, absolutely. I'll be answering them as well as I can. Hopefully I can answer them. So here is where you set up that email server though, right? So you can set up, the server that you're going to use, the username and password for it, all the good stuff. You can sign the mails with your secure keys, right? You can also make sure that there's a verification that's sent to it, you know, the port, all that fun stuff. You can maintain a connection to the, be careful with this one. I know it's recommended. It will keep an open line to the mail server, which sometimes is not a good thing. It often is, but, and it makes sure that it's actually connected and up, but, and you can enable TLS here. Obviously, this is something I just installed locally, so I don't have any mail server set up. And this is another one that you can kind of delve pretty deep into. So I'm just going to kind of go through here. You'll notice there's a setting here for mail delivery threads. This is what I was talking about earlier. This setting, I don't believe exists outside of Enterprise Server. Okay, so if you're and again, it's because if you're running a small business or something, they're using standard. You don't really need to send out quite so many emails. And keep in mind too that this really only affects mail that is literally being sent out by the ColdFusion server using something like CF Mail. If you're leveraging an external vendor to do mail stuff, obviously that's not going to affect them. Also, if you're using something like Amazon Web Services, they've got a an API-based mail service that you can leverage. Again, doesn't really affect that as well. You can use that up until the limits that are set by that particular vendor. So that's just another option if you're kind of in between. You know, you've got enough email that's sent that it's kind of, you're getting stuck, but not enough where you need all of the other things from Enterprise quite yet. You're growing, but you haven't grown and scaled enough for Enterprise. The middle ground can be to go through a third-party vendor. So the spool, all that good stuff. Oh, there's a view delivered mail, which I don't have because I don't have a mail server set up. All right, moving along. Scheduled tasks. Okay, this is one of the most awesome and powerful features that that ColdFusion has. This is another one that probably I could get into a very, very long talk on. I'm just going to cover it a little bit. Essentially, this is where you set up tasks that are going to be run by ColdFusion separate from you interacting with it, right? So the best sort of analogy I can give, these are cron jobs. If you're familiar with cron jobs. So let's say you need to download a bunch of data every morning and generate reports on it that end up getting pushed up to S3, let's say. Something along those lines. You can set that up here. When you schedule a new task, you've got the duration of when it'll start and end, you know, how often, whether it's reoccurring, whether it's a chain task, like maybe you have to do one thing and then have some other thing happen. Maybe there's some ETL that has to happen after the first thing happens. You can set that up here. And essentially what you're doing, and there are just so many settings here, but essentially what you're doing is you're going to build a file that's going to do the process. It's going to go through and run, and this is going to trigger that file based on the information that you put in up here. So the things you can do with this are almost endless. I have been on servers that have hundreds of scheduled tasks set up. Now, you do have to be careful. Keep in mind, this is not free in terms of resources. If you've got 100 scheduled tasks running and those tasks are incredibly intensive, if you're downloading huge amount of files, if you're processing huge amount of files, and you're trying to do that all at the same time, you can overwhelm a server very easily. I've seen it done. So this can actually have interesting effects too. I highly suggest that if you have enough of these tasks running and they're running often enough, have a separate server that just does this, because nothing's worse than having your main site go down or having your main application go down because you've got all of these scheduled tasks going. I've absolutely seen that happen. People get in early to the office, they log in at 7 a.m. and things are not working. Things are super slow. They think it's an issue with the server itself or whatever. And I've seen this happen. They ask for the server to be rebooted. and then all the scheduled tasks get blown up and they have to run again later. Anyway, it's so do be careful. It's a very powerful tool, but it's also something you need to use with forethought and planning. WebSockets. There is an amazing talk that is done by Minvo. I don't know. Who was it? There was some... No. Oh, gosh, who was it? I think it might have been Dave Ferguson that did it. Anyhow, there's a great talk. If you look back at some of the summits in the past, just search for WebSocket talk. There's a great talk about how to use WebSockets. I'm not going to kind of dive into that because, again, there's whole entire talks on how to use this stuff. But just know we do have a WebSocket service built in to ColdFusion. If you're not familiar with what a WebSocket is, by the way, when you normally have a page that goes out and requests some data to be displayed, it's a request response type of situation, and it's one way and then back, right? A WebSocket actually is a subscription to a particular data provider point. And so this can be used, for example, if you've ever seen, like on Facebook, when someone is doing a video and you're seeing like the likes come up and the things come up. So that is a form of WebSocket. They're actually using a GraphQL subscription, and under the hood, that actually uses the WebSocket technology. So it's really neat. It's a little bit of a learning curve to use, but once you use it, you can create amazing things like dashboards that are highly responsive and constantly changing with the data that's coming across. They're very, very cool. Definitely check it out. Charting. As you may or may not know, ColdFusion has charting included, CF chart, and you can use it to generate really cool imagery. Not a ton of people necessarily use this anymore because, of course, that entire ecosystem has exploded with lots and lots of amazing, incredible vendors coming out with new charting. You can use something like D3 to create anything you want and use ColdFusion to go and grab the data and put it into D3. However, we still have charting built in. It's still pretty awesome. I did a whole talk on that a few months ago. I think you can catch that on video on demand. And what this page does is it lets you cache some of the things that you're creating. So, for example, if you're generating reports and you want to take images and you're going to be doing it a lot, like let's say there's a lot of different reports based on this stuff, you can actually cache the images in the meantime to improve performance, because generating images is obviously a very costly action for a server to do. And so this can actually like put them up. You can put it into a disk so you don't have to regenerate them, and it can just pull that back and include it into a report. Time to live, things like that are available here as well. Font management. So font management, I just got 2 more minutes, and I don't think I'm going to make it through as many things as I thought I was going to be doing. But font management, this is actually a really, really important thing. Especially in 2018, I think in 2021, we added an absolute ton of fonts, and that actually solved a lot of problems in the past. If you are moving from an old version of ColdFusion to a new one, this is a very particular use case that I have seen blow up in people's faces. If you're moving from, I believe, like CF11, and you were using some PDF generation jars, there's a couple out there that do like obfuscation, like you can cover parts of a PDF. If you're using one of those, a lot of times, especially on Linux, those will use a particular set of fonts. Those fonts are no longer included with ColdFusion later on, and they will cause it to blow up very spectacularly. And the error is not an easy one to understand what is happening. So this is a place, and if that happens to you, what you would do is you would pull those fonts from the old install and add them here and register them with ColdFusion, and poof, everything starts working again. So this was one. I'm proud that we figured that one out, because my goodness, that error was it errors at the Java inflection point, which those errors are even more obscure and obfuscated than normal. All right. I'm just going to cover the rest of this of this thing, and then I'm going to get into questions. Document. So this is something that a lot of people don't know about. Some people like it a lot. I don't really know that I've used it much. You can actually integrate Openoffice with ColdFusion. This can help you generate things like Word documents, that sort of thing. And so this is where you would set that up locally. Java and JVM. Someone asked earlier about a deep dive into this page. Won't be able to do that because, my goodness, this is an incredibly powerful page and it does a lot of things, even though it's not that long. What does this do? This lets you specify the location of the JVM, first of all. Set a bunch of JVM settings. These are normally things that would be done inside of like Tomcat or whatever. There's a class path here. And then this right here, folks, these JVM arguments, this is a really, really, really incredible, powerful place that you can use to tune things like garbage collection. Mike Brunt, I believe, has a great talk and goes for at least an hour on how you can tune and figure out how to get the best performance out of your Java virtual machine using some of these features here to pass it things like garbage collection. And again, unfortunately, there's not one magic string to post in here because there isn't, unfortunately. So it all depends on what kind of load you're on, what kind of bandwidth you're on, what your application is doing, all of that. What your server looks like and all that. So I am going to hop into, I apologize, I'm 2 minutes over where I wanted to be for going into questions. So I'm going to jump past all the stuff I missed, and I'm just going to handle questions with all of my contact info here on this page. So starting off, Dave L says, I'm not sure if ACF 2021 is like this, but I've run into this problem with 2018 when the secure profile is enabled. The secure profile disables the use of CF info because it denies certain types of SQL statements. Is there a way to enable the secure profile but leave SQL unrestricted? I don't believe there is. Part of that profile locks down all of the places that we have identified as potential vectors for people to attack the ColdFusion install. So what you can do is you can follow the lockdown guide and just not do that particular thing if you need it, but definitely do some research and figure out what those vectors are that that could potentially exploit that, because you definitely don't want to leave your server open. By the way, and if you're in, for example, a military or government place, they do have, I think they're called STIGs, that pretty much tell you have to do these particular things. You have to lock these particular things out, or we consider your install unsecure. When it comes to enable global script protection, the one I skipped, setting in CF admin, is there a way to disable this in ColdFusion for a particular request? I would like to leave this feature on by default. However, I'd like to be able to turn it off for specific requests when I know only authorized users will need to submit data that would normally be replaced with invalid tags. No to that particular question. However, you can, so there's really no way that I know of to disable it for particular users. You can disable it for an application. So there is actually there's code that you can put in at your application.cfc level. And by the way, all of these things that I've been talking about are available for setting in application.cfc as well. Most of them are actually available via the API too, so that's pretty powerful. So that's kind of what, if you have a particular application that's being used by a particular set of users, that's one way that you could do it. Again, I would be super careful because that setting is a really, really powerful piece of security. And there's always ways that people can spoof user profiles. People can get access to users' computers. I mean, there's all these different ways. I think OWASP has me running scared. But there's always ways for the people who you don't want getting in through someone else's profile. So I would be very, very careful doing that. Could we have an example on scheduled tasks or give more details? I've never successfully made it work. I don't really have time today to do that, but I think I may do an entire talk on scheduled tasks. And so if you want to, Tehu, come, can you email me? My email is up on the in the question slide right now. It's takata@adobe.com. If you could just email me a reminder to ask for an example of a working scheduled task, I could try to send something over for you just to have like a working example to have that work for you. Dimitri asks, when would you recommend not to cache these? Sorry, Dimitri. So when you say these, which things were you talking about? Because there's lots and lots and lots of caches. I'm assuming this was like the template caches earlier on, and I only recommend not caching those when you're actively in development of your application. There's no reason not to cache them once they're up in production. And to be totally honest, I think even on staging and pre-prod and places like that on test, it's actually a pretty good idea to go ahead and get those things back into the cache just so that it's performing in the way that it will perform in your final production environment. They're just a pain in the rear end when you're doing actual development. Would you recommend clearing these caches on a routine basis, let's say once a quarter? No, those caches will actually, they have a time to live, so they will clear themselves based on like a schedule. Like, so sessions have a time to live, application has a time to live. I think the only scope that doesn't have a time to live is the server scope, which you probably shouldn't really be doing that. Generally speaking, you shouldn't be in that scope anyhow. What's the recommended setting for purge interval for a high traffic platform? I don't have a good answer for that. What does high traffic mean? That's one that you probably should do some testing. There's some really excellent testing tools out there that you can hit your server with. There's actually people whose like entire jobs is that you can actually hire someone to come in and hit your site with as many requests as you think match your user base. So so that's one way. To be government compliant, we ideally should have a J2EE session timeout for administrators of 10 minutes, but regular users use 15. Any good way to do that? Oh, man. That's a really good question. I think, yeah, that's potentially an issue. There may be a way when you're doing your authentication, and I'm assuming when you say administrators, you're meaning it's a local role. I think that's a tough one. I think there might be a way when you're doing authentication to change the session timeout for that particular user, but you would have to do it, oh gosh, because the scope is at a higher level. Yeah, I'm not sure, Brian. That might be something I'd have to ask one of the engineers to see if they're able to do that. Is Adobe going to get undelivered mail off CF Grid and also allow for multiple deletes or respooling at one time? You know, Brian, I don't have a question. Could you email me that question directly, and I will pass that on to the engineers? That's not one I know. Does Openoffice, LibreOffice need to be locally installed on the web server, or can the CF admin field reference a directory on another machine? I believe, and this is not necessarily one that I have a lot of experience with. It needs to be accessible through the server's ability to see drives. So that's really the answer there. If you can't come in here and browse the server and point to a directory that the server can see, it won't work. So I don't know if that answers that question or not. Cache templates. Okay, thank you, Dimitri. Yeah. So cache templates, I think I answered that. Can you give the link to download the free ColdFusion? Apurva, or her name is Aishwarya, but it's actually Apurva behind that name right now. They put in there, you can actually just go to adobe.com and search for ColdFusion, and all you have to do is just download the trial. And the trial, after 30 days of free at full functionality, will downgrade itself to the developer edition, and then you can use that locally for non-production use, remember, for as long as you'd like. And it's awesome. Installation issues with ColdFusion 20. Abdul, so that is out of scope for this talk. If you could please email here, if you have questions of that type, please email cfsup@adobe.com to ask about updates and having them blocked at your company. There's going to have to be something that's done probably at the firewall level to allow those to go by. Jess asked, when will CF have a good VS Code extension? Yes, soon. It's so soon. I've been using it. We are very, very close to launching that. I would say, don't hold me to it necessarily, but I think August is probably going to be the go live wild time when everybody's going to be able to get it. If you want a preview of it, we are going to be having at least one session, possibly two, that the engineers are going to be doing, showing off all of the new features at Dev Week, which is in July. So please go and sign up for that. It's free. It's online. Take a look there, and we will be having at least one session, possibly two, on VS Code that the engineers who worked on it will be doing. Jason asks, is there an IP limit with Developer Edition? Yes, Jason, there is. It's 2. Actually, it's 2 plus localhost. So I guess technically 3. Why the code analyzer dropped an error of using create object as if code. That's Poria. You asked a question about code analyzer related to Corba. Could you please email that directly to me? I need to pass that on. I think that's just because we've deprecated that feature. The Corba feature is no longer there. Who's my favorite Star Trek captain? Oh my goodness. I really got to go with Picard. I'm sorry. That's like the easy answer, but Picard was my first the first time that I actually ever really interacted with Star Trek was Next Generation. Love them. Oh gosh. RA gave me a whole RA, that's probably out of scope for me to be able to answer. That's a whole query, and I'm not sure what that is, how to answer that. I'm almost out of time. If you could email that to me, please, that would be fantastic. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything here. Right on. Okay, cool. I think I have covered everything. Thank you all for joining me today. Part 2 is going to be next month. We're going to cover more of the administrator, and as you can see, we basically didn't even get out of the first tab. There's a lot in here, and we will try to get into things like maybe the API, setting things potentially in application.cfc. We'll see. I may have to go to 3 talks because the administrator is really awesome and powerful. I appreciate everyone coming and joining me today. Thank you for all your awesome questions. If your question didn't get answered, or I didn't give you an answer that that was, you're fully satisfied with, please email me, takata@adobe.com. I answer all my emails. My door is always open. Also, if you want to request some office hours just to chat for 15 minutes with me, go ahead and jump on calendly.com. Just not this Monday because I have it off for my anniversary. Thank you very much. Anything past then will be great. You can find me on Twitch twice a week, Tuesdays at 1 p.m. PST at twitch.tv/Mark Takata. My GitHub is there. My LinkedIn is there. Please add me on LinkedIn. It's been wonderful. Fantastic. And yes, and every month we will be having a webinar, and then you'll get extra fun stuff in July, because not only will you get my webinar, I'll be doing at least one talk at that event at Dev Week. By the way, everyone, if you haven't heard yet, ColdFusion Summit 2022 is in person this year in October 3rd and 4th in Las Vegas. Sign up. Google CF Summit 2022. You'll get right onto the page. Please sign up. Please join us. Come down. It's going to be amazing. It is 2 days of the most fun that you have ever had talking about ColdFusion, listening to people talk about ColdFusion. There's a party. There's tons of talks. There's tons of vendors. It's the most amazing time. You'll make friends. You'll find people to hire. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If you're looking for people to hire, there's a ton of people there who do ColdFusion and have been doing it for many, many years. Anyhow, I'm over time. So again, thank you all. And hopefully I will see you here again next month. All right. Bye, everyone.